Thank you everybody for being here. My name is Awasar and I am Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the African Studies Center. And Eye on Africa is our weekly seminary series. And we're very delighted today to have Bernie Moore as our guest speaker. And before I hand it over, a brief introduction. So Bernard Moore is lecturer of African history at Alma College, and he is a PhD candidate at Michigan State University. His research is broadly concerned with the political economy of rural Namibia during the 20th century, with a focus on the country's arid southern district. His PhD dissertation examines the intertwined politics of land tenure, labor relations, and agricultural production in Namibia's sheep farming sector. His first book, co-authored with Luregn, I'll pass it, is titled "Space is the Ultimate Luxury, Capitalist, Conservationists, and Ancestral Land in Namibia." And it will be published with Brill in December 2024. Thank you so much for accepting to do this lecture, Bernard Moore.
Okay, I'll unmute myself here if you.
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Well, thank you all for coming today. I want to express my appreciation to the African Studies Center, especially Dr. Saar, for constantly supporting MSU graduate student research, including my own. So thank you all for the consistent support always. I will share my screen so that you can all follow along. Okay. So thank you all for coming today. My presentation, The Night Harvests, intends to show what is at stake when scholars try to understand the history and the political economy and the ecology of nature conservation outside questions of land and questions of property. This is especially the case in the context of settler colonialism and its legacies. So this is somewhat of a new project for me, so I'd be happy for any feedback which those in the room or those online have. Any feedback or suggestions are welcome. Let's begin. So the 1960s were years of high apartheid across Southern Africa, and this was particularly the case in Namibia. In January 1964, the apartheid administration in Namibia proposed converting African communal areas in the northwest of Namibia into two separate homelands, often derogatively termed Bantustans, called Kaoko and Damaraland. In order to give off the impression that these puppet states could actually sustain their populations and possess viable economies, the administration bought a number of white settler farms to add to some acreage to these homelands. And this was the case across all of Namibia's apartheid-era homelands. As it relates to the northwest of Namibia, though, the administration chose a very controversial policy to increase the size of these homelands, which was reducing the size of Etosha National Park and converting the western quarter of this game reserve into commonage for Damaraland and Kaoko. As the first proclaimed game reserve in Namibia dating back to 1907, Etosha Park was the crown jewel of the Southwest Africa Division of Nature Conservation, which was sort of formalized in the late 1950s to allow the state to guide the development of Namibia as a safari tourism and trophy hunting destination. For conservationists amongst the white settler population in Namibia and their allies abroad, reducing the size of Etosha National Park was tantamount to ecocide. In typical racist language of the era, one self-proclaimed conservationist in Namibia, the famous Hubertus Graf zu Castel-Rudenhausen, he petitioned to cut back on the size of the homelands instead. And he wrote, quote, "Non-Europeans are not preservers of wild animals," end quote, and that Africans would exterminate Etosha's wildlife. The administration, though, would not budge, however. Unable to keep Africans from entering Etosha National Park, the Division of Nature Conservation instead took the drastic decision to depopulate the entire game population from the western portion of the park. A game capture unit was initiated, and between 1964 and 1968, the unit removed so much wildlife from that portion of Etosha that it could not be sustainably relocated to all of the other state-owned game reserves in Namibia. The Division of Nature Conservation instead chose to sell the remaining animals, mostly zebra, kudu, gemsbok, and springbok, to white settler farmers in Namibia who were keen to diversify their sheep farming operations by building breeding herds of game animals in order to tap into the trophy hunting market, as well as the game meat markets. This was the beginning of an outstandingly close relationship between the Division of Nature Conservation and private white farmers. And over the following 25 years, nature conservation would continue to decentralize its operations away from the state. This reached its zenith during one weekend in 1981, when more than 1,500 zebra were rounded up by the game capture unit and sold off to white settler farmers. By the end of apartheid, far more wildlife existed on Namibia's commercial farms than in the national parks or African communal areas combined. Historical studies of nature conservation and wildlife policies in Africa have overwhelmingly focused on national parks and state-centered endeavors. One of the most well-known works which approaches it this way is The Empire of Nature by John Mackenzie, pictured here on the top left. He and scholars who followed him rightly showed that national parks of the early 20th century were intimately bound to the consolidation of the colonial project on the African continent. Lobbying by elite nature preservation societies in Europe resulted in legislation which protected game from hunters and which provided physical space for game in the form of national parks and game reserves. Unsurprisingly, this was counter to the wishes of African residents who were excluded from the material benefits of game utilization and conservation. Ultimately, this trajectory of conservation, as viewed by Mackenzie and others, was viewed primarily as a form of state capture and state custodianship, whereby the land as commons was transformed into a national park run by the colonial state. Wildlife would transform from something considered ownerless into state property, epitomized by the category royal game, generally applied to elephant, rhinoceros, and giraffe, wildlife deemed to be property of the king. Now, while these frameworks fit okay in the case maybe of East Africa, it's far less applicable when examining the history of settler colonialism in South Africa and Namibia, despite a lot of attempts by scholars to do so. As the presentation shows, from very early on, the colonial and apartheid governments in the region decentralized most of their conservation operations away from the state and onto private white landowners. This was motivated less by altruistic goals regarding game preservation, and it rather functioned as an economic subsidy and legal protection for white farmers themselves. Now, if historians of nature conservation in Namibia focus only upon official state-sanctioned endeavors, we get but a tiny little snapshot of what would eventually become a massive industry. So as just one single example, during 1988, the wildlife industry brought the state less than 2% of the revenue which the private sector earned. To understand nature conservation and wildlife policy in Namibia, one needs to step away from studying national parks and public game reserves and instead move into studying private farms. Even today, long after apartheid, many of the most visited and most profitable ecotourism operations exist on private farms, not national parks. So in order to situate this, let's remind ourselves of Namibian land tenure for a moment. While the Germans had indeed colonized and settled some parts of Namibia during the post-genocide years, the vast majority of white settler farmers entered Namibia after South Africa took control, not before. When the Germans gave up Namibia after the First World War, there were 1,331 farms sold off to white settlers. By the time that the South African administration made that old decision to curtail the size of the national park, there were more than 5,000 commercial farms sold off to white settlers. Now, up until the Second World War, wildlife policy in Namibia was actually based on this model of state custodianship that I described above. Game was the property of the administrator for Southwest Africa, and only through his magistrates could white farmers and hunters take out licenses to hunt game. Black Namibians were generally forbidden entirely. That policy was quite frustrating to landowners, however. They had accepted that the state owned the precious minerals under the ground because, frankly, they had no capacity to mine them on their own. But they nevertheless sought ownership over the flora and fauna existing above ground. In the aftermath of the Second World War, these wildlife policies would be increasingly challenged. Between 1945 and 1960, close to 35,000 square miles of Namibian farmland were surveyed and sold off, mostly to returning white servicemen who were able to purchase the properties at extremely subsidized prices. Because most of the quality farmland in central Namibia had already been part of earlier settler initiatives, the Southwest Africa administration pushed deeper into the Namib and the Kalahari deserts, drilling additional boreholes and settling more than 1,000 families on these peripheral lands. Most scholars of settler colonialism see the 1950s and 60s as movements away from this process, but in Namibia, it was just entering a new gear. Most of the newly settled areas of southern Namibia and along the Namib and Kalahari deserts were able to quickly enter the flourishing Karakul sheep industry. This breed of sheep is not kept for wool or for mutton, but rather for lambskin pelts, which are sold into the global fur fashion industry, particularly ladies' fur coats. Karakul sheep were initially imported from Central Asia, and they proved remarkably durable in the Namibian deserts as well as the rocky landscapes. The rapid growth of the industry after the Second World War meant that many of these desert-adjacent white-owned farms were surveyed and planned explicitly for this Karakul industry. So let's take one farm as an example. This one is Kanan, the westerly-most commercial farm in Luregn district. Its neighbor to the west is the Namib Desert. Kanan was surveyed in the late 1940s with the explicit belief that Karakul sheep would thrive there. And this massive property was sold to a returning Afrikaans-speaking soldier named Petrus Albertus Low. He quickly used the generous loan schemes of the land settlement program to stock up the farm with more than 3,000 Karakul ewes. Now, Kanan is a dry place. And depending on the weather patterns, when you arrive, one would be tempted to believe that it was ecologically unsound to use this land for commercial farming in the first place. I mean, come on, it's dry as hell. But deserts are not dead places, however, and a little bit of rain does go a long way. Such that during pre-colonial times, we have archaeological and documentary evidence of Nama and San herders using the lands west of these terrace mountains as reserve grazing during years of above average rainfall. Here is Kanan in 2021, about 2 months after light rains. And here's Kanan in 2022, when the grass eventually reached waist height. Given that southwestern Namibia saw above average rainfall from the late 1940s through the early 1960s, it makes sense why the Surveyor General's office and the Low family saw Kanan as a choice property for Karakul sheep farming. Nevertheless, these farmers along the Namib Desert understood that rain was fickle, and they would have to constantly import alfalfa feed to offset the effects of Namibia's frequent droughts. This is what Kanan looked like earlier this year. Kanan and neighboring farms, however, function as grazing sites for vast herds of game, which migrate between the Namib Desert and the Terrace and Naukluft mountain ranges. Farmers like Low saw not drought, but wildlife as the greatest threat to their farming operations. When hundreds of hungry game animals descend upon unfenced farms like Canaan, although Canaan is now fenced, even rich grazing can be decimated in no time. Lowe and his neighbors engaged in massive extermination operations of Namib desert game, recrafting the desert as a place for sheep, not for wildlife. Now, many within South African and European conservation organizations saw this trend as deeply troubling. And they called on the administration to put a stop to what they viewed as illegal poaching by white settlers. Given the profitability of the Karakul sector and tense electoral politics in the early days of apartheid, the administrator was unwilling to put any pressure on the Southwest Africa Agricultural Union, which represented these farmers. Instead, he formed a commission tasked to reconfigure wildlife policy in Southwest Africa, Namibia, pictured here. And in typical fashion of the times, nearly all the commissioners were members or officers of the Agricultural Union. So bit of conflict of interest here. Rather than calling these farmers poachers of royal game, as the legislation would have permitted them to do, it instead set in motion the process of granting landowners full property rights over most species of wild animals, which were residents on their farms. They could hunt when they chose, and poaching was reconfigured as livestock theft, which carried a much harsher punishment in court. The commissioners admitted, quote, that property rights cannot be constantly transferred depending on which side of the fence you see the animal. But they nevertheless saw property rights as both an individual aspect belonging to one particular landowner and societal as something which furthered the white settler colonial project. In other words, for the commissioners, it didn't really matter which landowner owned the game, so long as the wildlife belonged to white settler farmers at large. The commissioners used the carrot of property rights over wildlife in order to push the stick that farmers needed to fence their properties in order to claim these four-hooved wild beasts as property. Over the 15 years following the commission, nearly the entirety of Namibian farms would be fenced, drastically improving the economic output of sheep farming, but also bestowing upon farmers the right to utilize game when sheep does not pay. Even Canaan, as huge and dry and far away as it is, built this expensive jackal-proof fencing along its boundaries in the 1960s, pictured here. Now, some of this commission's recommendations were put into law in 1951, with full property rights being delayed until 1967, with the Nature Conservation Proclamation of that year. But in the meantime, the permit system that you would apply for in order to hunt on your own was loosened for white applicants seeking to eliminate wildlife on their lands, whether for the purposes of protecting grazing for sheep or as a means to enter the meat market. Farmers along the Namib Desert expanded their control over desert game. During 1958 alone, more than 13,000 separate hunting permits were issued to shoot zebra in the Namib Desert, with each allowing you to shoot up to 20 animals. Farmers were encouraged to apply for such permits after each rainfall to prevent game numbers from rising too quickly in the desert. No property rights, though, were granted to Black Namibians, as they were forbidden from private land ownership. Remember, you only were able to obtain rights over game if you already had rights over land. African communal areas were technically property of the administration, and in those cases, a system of state custodianship remained. During the 1950s and 1960s, numerous African leaders cited instances of white farmers driving in jeeps onto communal areas to drive wildlife out of these areas onto private farms. This was legalized theft en masse. Now, farmers were not bestowed property rights over all game species. I try not to put really complicated things on slides, but here's one of those things, and I promise I'll boil it down for you all. Some species did remain protected, such as rhinoceros and elephant. But for the most numerous and economically profitable species like gemsbok and kudu and springbok, these fully belong to white farmers now. So what we're looking at here with this chart, I hope you can all see my mouse. We are interested in this purple category, game as property. And what this chart on the whole shows is that as legislation changes, and legislation which is prompted often by changes in the farming sector, the actual legal category of different game species changes. We don't just have domesticated animals versus wild animals. We actually have a very large assemblage of different categories into which species fell into. And depending on the legislation, this changed. But from 1967, the most numerous game species all became game as property. Some, though, became this category specially protected game, something which emerged from this royal game category, such as elephant and black rhinoceros. But it's important to remember that during drought years, when sheep were performing poorly, farmers could tap into the game meat industry, those species in purple here, as well as allow local or foreign trophy hunters to shoot on their land. Wildlife subsidized sheep farming. Now, though it had been already operating informally for several years, this game capture team of the Southwest Africa Division of Nature Conservation was officially inaugurated in 1969. By this point, they had already been experimenting with new tranquilizer serums and delivery mechanisms, pioneering the first ever helicopter-driven darting of a black rhino. In the immediate aftermath of the Oerendal plan that curtailed the size of Etosha National Park, the Division of Nature Conservation also purchased a small Dakota aircraft, which by 1970 had flown more than 140,000 miles across Namibia's northern African homelands, conducting game surveys and making recommendations for game capture and transport. They would also contract their services to private white farmers to do game counts on their own lands. So in addition, with partnering with white farmers, nature conservation also had a relationship with most national parks in South Africa, as well as several zoos in West Germany. While most of the game which the team captured were brought to Etosha National Park, this was ordinarily just a transit zone before selling the animals on to other private farms or else to zoos and parks abroad. From 1970 also, white landowners were allowed to apply for zoo export permits as well, leading to the emergence of a rural game dealer profession. Specific data is scarce, but we do have a record of a number of high-profile capture and transport operations. In 1968, near Njanji in the far north of Kaoko homeland in northwestern Namibia, at least 114 black-faced impala were tranquilized, captured, and transported by truck to Etosha. In September 1969, another 38 were captured at Omuhonga near the Angolan border in Kaoko and shipped on a Dakota airplane to Etosha, a Dakota airplane flown and operated by the South African Air Force. In October 1970, as pictured here, rowan antelopes were captured in Kavango homeland near the Botswana border and shipped on a Lockheed Hercules aircraft. Perhaps the highest profile capture operations involved the most valuable species of all, black rhinoceros. Nature conservation first began to capture and transport this species in 1967, though after a few years, they had perfected the tranquilizers and transport procedures. During 1970, 21 black rhino were captured in Damaraland homeland near Kurikas, and they were moved to Etosha. As an endangered species from then up until today, black rhino transfer was perhaps the most valued species for tourism purposes, whether within national parks or on private farmland. And it's important to remember that the Damara Representative Authority, the governing body in charge of the homeland, had no say in such relocations, nor did they receive any form of compensation. So in 1966, approximately 80% of Namibia's black rhino were outside protected areas, within African reserves or homelands. But by 1975, approximately 70% of black rhino were now within protected areas, either on national parks run by the apartheid government, such as Etosha or Waterberg, or else on registered private game farms. Now, in the voluminous semi-biographical, semi-scientific writing on nature conservation in Namibia, which, let me be clear, is almost entirely written by white farmers or former employees of the apartheid-era nature conservation division. There's a subtle but consistent racialized discourse going on, which echoes earlier perspectives on wildlife management. There was a fundamental lack of trust in the homelands to manage nature conservation affairs, which probably offers a little too much of a generous view of how much autonomy these institutions had in the first place. Nevertheless, by the end of the 1970s, most likely still believed that if it were not for the guiding hand of some enlightened white conservationists alongside the South African military, these species would all be decimated. That is what echoes throughout so many of these books. Many likely still bought into Castell Rudenhausen's statement, which I read before, that, quote, non-Europeans are not preservers of wild animals. Indeed, reports of poaching during the 1980s in northern Namibia by the anti-apartheid movement, SWAPO, as well as the South African Defense Forces counterinsurgent death squad, Kufut, which was also staffed by Black Namibians, seemed to prove in the minds of these conservationists the validity of this racialized claim. However, as we have seen, large swaths of these northern homelands were already depopulated of wild animals prior to the liberation movement picking up steam in the first place. And this isn't to downplay the very real, if occasionally sensationalized, issue of poaching, but rather that we must place nature conservation within its political and economic context. And throughout all these years, the Division of Nature Conservation was not an independent agency with their own agenda. It ultimately answered to farmers. After all, the governmental unit throughout all these years was not a Department of Nature Conservation. It was a Department of Agriculture and Forestry and Nature Conservation, with agriculture being the low note anchoring the whole chorus. The legislation surrounding property rights over game, as well as extensive game capture teams supplying white farmers with exotic game species that allowed farmers to target these trophy hunters from overseas, was all part of a network of subsidies diversifying the income of farmers. And these subsidies came in handy during the late 1970s and early 1980s, when Namibia experienced its worst drought in history. Furthermore, at that time, recessions in Europe and North America led to contractions in luxury spending, which particularly hurt the fur coat business and thus the Karakul sheep industry. These subsidies were coming in handy. Let's enter Mr. Anton von Wietersheim. This German Namibian grew up on one of the most successful Karakul farms in the country, which his grandfather had started half a century earlier. As a young man who took over the farm just as the Karakul sector began to falter, he understood the needs to diversify his operations. He split the farm in two, paying some of his bills with a smaller Karakul sheep farming operation, and then he tapped into the German tourism market, bringing in trophy hunters to his property. He also sold game meat to local butchers and sausage manufacturers. By 1973, Anton von Wietersheim was one of the first proper game farmers in the country, and he was elected as the inaugural game farmer chairman of the whites-only Namibia Agricultural Union, or then Southwest Agricultural Union. Von Wietersheim partnered with the Division of Nature Conservation to develop what became known as the Nagoes program, the night harvests. Von Wietersheim and Nature Conservation operations ran training programs on his farm, Gras Zuid, pictured here, training hunters in the art of shooting from a moving vehicle, training hunters in night hunting and in capture techniques. Now, while farmers were thankful for the exotic game which they had obtained through these game capture operations, the vast majority of wildlife on farms were really ordinary species like springbok and kudu and oryx. In the context, though, of drought, as the Namib Desert farms, which we saw before, showed us, farmers jealously guard the grazing for their livestock. The goal of this night harvest program was to relieve grazing burdens by culling between 30 and 50% of a farm's wildlife population in a single night. Nagoes was not hunting, Nagoes was a harvest. And in the context of drought and declining karakul pelt prices, farmers really wanted to reap the rewards of this harvest. So I will warn all, it will get a little graphic from here on out. Nature conservation, along with some private hunting companies, would come to a farm a day or two before the night harvest to set up a field abattoir and a refrigerated truck. After all, they didn't just want to shoot the game, they wanted to sell the meat on to urban markets in Cape Town and Windhoek. Shooting teams would arrive to the farm and establish locations where game could be cornered and funneled into small channels, such as along dry riverbeds or along the base of cliffs. Shooting teams were generally 4 men, including a driver, an assistant, a marksman, and a light operator. After sundown, each shooting team would then drive around these massive properties, returning with 15 to 20 springbok carcasses per load, going back into the field several times each night. Hundreds of springbok and dozens of kudu and gemsbok were culled every single night during these night harvest operations. The quantity of meat harvested in each operation was massive, and while the farmer himself had to pay the shooting team, he was paid by the meat dealers per kilogram for the carcasses. And the Southwest Africa administration, as the government, also compensated the farmer for his efforts towards drought alleviation. Night harvests did not just give more grazing for his sheep. The night harvests through the meat were immensely profitable for the farm owner. At the end of the night, the refrigerated truck would drive out to Windhoek or Cape Town, and the shooting team would move on to the next farm for the next harvest. During 1977 alone, there were at least 180 night harvests on white-owned commercial farms in Namibia, and the harvest would continue on for several more years. Night harvests subsidized apartheid Namibia's agricultural sector during the worst drought in the country's history. During the height of the drought, farmers were able to reap more than 3 million rand per year from night harvests alone. And for those farmers who sought to move away from karakul sheep as the industry declined, they could cull their game and replace their flocks with mutton sheep or cattle. Black Namibians in the communal areas, however, possessed no property rights over game. There were no night harvests there, and they were forced to watch their paychecks decline as the drought intensified. Now, this is sort of not just the story of the injustices of apartheid. However, I don't, as important as these analyses are, I don't really think it surprises us much that apartheid's planners and beneficiaries profited as much as possible from unjust legislation. This, however, is also a contemporary story as much as it is a historical one. Since Namibia's independence in 1990, this monochromatically white Namibia Agricultural Union and Namibia Professional Hunters Association have lobbied heavily to have more species being added to the list of those over which landowners have property rights. The last remnant of this old royal game category is just the black rhinoceros now. At the same time, general condemnation over poaching and smuggling of rhino horn has led many to petition that the black rhino become property as well. In dog whistle language reminiscent of the apartheid years, landowners have argued that the new multiracial government did not possess the resources or the will to protect wildlife, and commercialization via privatization was the solution. The Namibian government did not fully give in to them, though, and in 1993, they began planning what became known as the Black Rhino Custodianship Program, which loans black rhino on an indefinite basis to landowners. The program receives funding from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and while landowners do not own the black rhino, and they cannot hunt the black rhino, they can still profit from the black rhino through adjacent tourism and hunting operations. According to one American hunter I interviewed, who went on a leopard and ostrich hunt on farm Saint-Fontaine, which is pictured here, even though he couldn't put a bullet in the rhino, hunting other species with rhino in sight was, quote, a thrill and an excitement which I could not even imagine, end quote. He paid the owner of San Fontaine $8,000 for that 2-day leopard hunt, by the way. The benefits of the Black Rhino custodianship program are not just financial. According to one of the designers of the program, who is a rhinoceros veterinarian himself, he remarked, quote, "I always suspected that a lot of Black Rhino custodians went into the program as a way to protect against land expropriation. If they're guarding the government's rhinos from poachers, then they're probably less likely to have their lands taken by the new government," end quote. In the context of post-apartheid land insecurity and land reform, making the transformation from being a white capitalist farmer to becoming a private game farmer may be the most secure form of land tenure imaginable. Whether it's guarding Black rhino from purchasing white rhino, pictured here in an ad from Tuprias, who's a wildlife dealer in Namibia, or purchasing any other species for that matter, game farming in Namibia has become immensely profitable. It has built from this apartheid-era days of game capture and night harvests. In it before. Oh, okay. I hope I didn't lose people. It seems I lost internet connection and then came back. Okay. Here we are. So, Hello, everybody. Sorry about this. The internet has been going in and out, but I'll bring us back here. And hopefully it won't give out on us now. So land laws have changed, but at the same time, the cost of entry for individuals into this sector is immense. And ecotourism is promoted as sustainable development by international organizations, the United Nations, and many scholarly presentations at places like here at Michigan State University. But at the same time, a lot of these views are rather stuck within this understanding that ecotourism is on the one hand a natural reflection of endemic biodiversity, or on the other hand, it's some economic sector which possesses transformative potential for reducing poverty. And as we see here, it is not, and it does not. While the case of Namibia may be an extreme one, private capital's control over the agenda of and profits from nature conservation is a trend which is increasing across the continent. And this is a troubling trend. In the context of building a just post-apartheid and post-colonial society, ecotourism may function more as a roadblock than a conduit. Let's come to a close by returning to the Namib Desert. This is farm Vergenoeg, which is the northern neighbor of Canaan, who we saw before. It's a great name for a farm which borders the desert. It means far enough, Vergenoeg. Like Canaan, Vergenoeg was for many years a profitable karakou farm, and its owner was actually chairman of the Karakou Breeders Association during the 1980s. Nowadays, Vergenoeg is a much more quiet place, however. It's now occupied by Mr. Timotheus Ekanjo, a veteran of the anti-apartheid movement, who received the farm through independent Namibia's land reform programs. These programs are intended to solve some of the inequities in land access after so many decades of colonialism and apartheid. When Vergenoeg's former owner intended to sell the farm, he had to first offer it to the government. And in this case, they bought it and settled Mr. Ekanjo and his family. Ekanjo, however, does not own this property. It belongs to the Ministry of Lands. And Ekanjo only has a 99-year renewable lease. Furthermore, as a beneficiary of the land reform program, Ekanjo is expected to take up farming on a full-time basis, as are all of his descendants who inherit the lease. As merely a leaseholder, he owns only his sheep and cattle, not his wildlife. According to his contract with the ministry, he is expressly forbidden from applying for a meat dealer's license or engaging in any form of hunting apart from his own family's table. Nor is he allowed to bring in trophy hunters. In addition, Ekanjo is not permitted to build a lodge, a hotel, or engage in any tourism activities. He's to be a farmer and nothing more. Contrast Mr. Ekanjo and Vergenoeg with Canaan today. And we can see the long-term effects of differential property rights. Canaan is no longer a sheep farm, but a tourism establishment owned by a consortium of local Namibian companies, Dutch private equity firms, and the offshore investment trust of Angelina Jack on the computer, unfortunately. So, friends, I appreciate your patience here. I have decided to remove myself from MSU's internet. We have a very good computer science department, but I don't know what they're doing right now. I'm on my cell phone, so here we go. So, to come to a close, Kanan brings in about a dozen gap year students every year to help out with conservation initiatives. These students pay Kanan to reside on the property for a few months, and most of this work involves unpaid manual labor, tearing down more than 50 miles of boundary fencing, and removing most of the infrastructure which made Kanan a profitable sheep farm in the first place. Like is the case with all aspects of the global economy, private equity's main business is stripping and selling the assets. This jackal-proof fencing was later sold on to a commercial sheep farmer about 75 miles away. And these volunteers were nevertheless smiling ear to ear, blissfully unaware that they were paying to volunteer for a for-profit company. By removing or destroying everything made Kanan a farm in the first place, the owners are subtly working to prevent what happened with their neighbor Vergenoeg. Timoteo Sikanjo is ultimately the only Black resident for close to 100 miles in all directions. And the Namibian government only agreed to buy the farm because it clearly possessed the infrastructure of a successful sheep farm. Times have changed from the age of night harvests, but nature conservation's relationship to land tenure has not changed very much. The wildlife economy, whether for hunting, harvesting, or photographing, remains tied to ongoing endeavors by a small number of wealthy individuals to control and profit from massive expanses of land. Ultimately, democratizing the wildlife economy in Namibia means confronting this land question head on. Thank you all for hearing and being patient with the internet. I really do appreciate it. I will make this bigger and you can see my face a bit more now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very exciting presentation. Now we open it to questions. We start in the room, and if you have questions online, you can either type it on or raise your hand and be allowed to speak.
So two questions. One is more directly on the topic you mentioned, the night harvest, and the second one is in terms of kind of contemporary. So my first question is, during these night harvests, I know that just before that you mentioned how all the wildlife on the property was like the owners of the property own that, but would they use these night harvests as covers for other types of unregulated like hunting or activities? So I guess were they hunting some of those endangered animals during these night? And then my second question is, I think you may have kind of just answered it, kind of land tenure issue is still going on, but is the government doing anything to address these inequalities, right? Like, are we going to see more African-owned game parks versus the white land?
Okay.
So for those on the internet,
Zachary
asked two questions. First, could these night harvests have been covers for illegal or unregulated hunting activity rather than just hunting springboks, but maybe I guess rhino as well or something like this? I don't have evidence that states that it was, but this is something that I want to dig into a little bit more. I've been able to speak to a few people who participated in these operations, but I hope to get a little bit more information. They don't show in the official reports, I'll put it that way. As it relates to ongoing, his second question, which is ongoing efforts by the Namibian government to try to address the land question. I mean, the land reform program, the National Resettlement Program, has purchased a tremendous amount of land for Black Namibians, whether more formal settlement on a large portion like Vergenoeg or some of the group resettlement acts. It has been quite a lot, has been settled. But again, it is targeted towards agriculture. This was a program begun through the Ministry of Agriculture, not
anything related to nature conservation. So we are not yet seeing there be a connection between the amount of land purchased for farming and the amount of land available for maybe commercial tourism operations. But again, this is still something I'm digging into. So thank you. I think we have, there appears to be an echo. Says, oh, okay. Valeria asks a question. If this information were broadly known, would there be any pressure for equity? What can a Black farmer for 100 miles do for equity? That is a tough question, and I don't have a perfect answer for that. The difficult bit is the way that the ministry handles settlement farmers is on the basis of the Ministry of Lands and Resettlement in coordination with agricultural extension offices. So that is the way they organize. As it relates, though, to the white or corporate landowners, they're not even organizing anymore through agricultural unions anymore, because that they're not tied to that anymore. They're tied to much broader networks of international tourism and things of this. It's a very difficult situation. I think one of the bigger questions that needs to happen as it relates to equity is there needs to either be, on the one hand, a recognition that when the government purchases land, its usefulness should not just be viewed in the form of agriculture, but in the form of other kinds of land uses, such that perhaps Canaan might actually be a nice property for the government to take over. Although I'm sure the Dutch private equity would not like that, because ultimately they're thinking about it through the lens of agriculture. But if they thought about it in a much broader way, perhaps we could see much more of these endeavors. But it is a very difficult situation, and it's something that I'm working on, but we'll see how far I'm able to go with researching this. Thank you. Chinjarai.
Yes, Ben, thanks for the presentation. But I think one of the issues that you must also realize when you're talking about land in Namibia itself, only 10% of the land they call it suitable for agriculture, but it's marginal. Then the real percentage is and then to venture into farming, ecotourism, and all these, sometimes you have to do it, even in real farming itself, you must go to intensive. You need a lot of capital because the country is semi-desert. So most of these people that are beneficiaries of some of this land don't have any money to invest. You need the capital, even venture into international tourism like this. They don't have the money. So you are giving someone land to do something, but without giving the capital. Whereas the previous, you see, white farmers, the collateral that they could use to borrow money from the banks, the system also favored them. It's all over. That's why the land reform question in Namibia, South Africa, Zimbabwe, I think to some extent, they face the same challenges, even where land is very good like Zimbabwe. That's why we have so many failures. But in Namibia, it's worse because it's very desert. I live in Namibia, totally. I also studied some of these even did land reform and tried to compare, especially with respect to gender perspectives. I wanted to see how many women have benefited from this land reform program. But yet they are the ones who participate. And you also find that when you bring a name like Ekanju, where Jerry Ekanju was in the presidential contest of the island.
Well, different Ekanjo. This one's a different Ekanjo.
I know. It could be, if you trace the lineage, it could be. So it's not easy to bring about equity in terms of entering the tourist market and then the land reform programs, the land and the weather conditions.
Yeah.
That's why I say I'm 100 miles. No surprise. I know all these places that we're talking about. We visit some of them, including the Tushapa, long time.
Mm.
Yeah, so with those issues.
Yeah.
So it's a big further.
Yeah, I will keep that stuff in mind. For those on the web, Ginger, I asked concerning land reform. You know, it's a very capital intensive operation to get into farming or tourism, and it's not just a matter of turning over title deeds, but everything which comes with it. And he's absolutely correct. And that's partially what made settler farming such a successful operation profitably. Is it was subsidized in a lot of ways. There were these sorts of things, and you can't just hand over a title deed and expect it to solve the problems. There needs to be support. But one of the important things, and it needs centralized government support, is if I am a cattle farmer and I farm meat, and I make a 300-gram steak, and Dr. Zulu takes a bite of my steak, Dr. Zulu does not know if that steak was from a white farmer or a black farmer, ultimately. It's steak, it's beef, it tastes a certain way. Now, of course, there's broader economic issues of how much grass was there for this meat to grow, what were the distribution networks in order for it to reach the shops. But it's not always the case, really, as it relates to tourism, because these require networks overseas in order to bring people in. These require often, with Namibia, Germany is the main tourism market. So the ability to have German business partners, to be able to conduct business in German, all of these things are aspects which factor into tourism. And that's why governments and universities have to play a role in these sorts of initiatives, whether for training or otherwise. Oh, there's another question here. Perfect. So Solomon asks, what can the government do through legislative actions to facilitate land ownership and remove the barriers to economic development and investment opportunities for its people? Can the government and its leaders exercise full authority without the remnants of neo-colonial controls over Namibia? That's a great question, Solomon. Thank you. So the current land reform legislation, which is the 1995 Agricultural and Commercial Land Reform Act, it is what they call a willing buyer, willing seller program, where if a farmer wants to sell his property, he must first offer it to the government first. And the farmer sets a price, and the government decides, do they want to buy it for that price? Now, the farmer can't, after, let's say, offering it for 2 million Namibian dollars to the government, he can't then offer it to 1 million on the private sector, like elevate the price for the government and then not for the private sector. That would be a violation of the laws. He then has to try to sell it for 2 million on the private sector if the government says no. The problem with this, of course, is that the government doesn't set the prices. The government doesn't set the prices. The government has no say in this whatsoever. So it has led to, if you look at statistics relating to price per hectare of farmland, it has increased from about 70 Namibian dollars around the time this law was passed up to more than 2,000 Namibian dollars per hectare now. So, and that's partially rising land prices in general, it's partially inflation and things of this nature, but it's also partially a recognition that the willing buyer, willing seller model is simply just not functioning. And the price of farms have increased dramatically. So what can the government do? Reform this willing buyer, willing seller model dramatically. And one does not need to necessarily, and Ginger, I might be the expert on this, advocate for Zimbabwe-style fast-track land reform. But at the same time, recognition that there is a recognition that it is not functioning anymore. And there have been several conferences sponsored by the government to try to identify new ways to move forward. And there is a political party called the Landless People's Movement, which is now the #2 political party in Namibia. So we will see what comes of this. But Solomon, thank you for that question.
Yeah.
Professor.
Yeah, thank you very much for very interesting talk and presentation. Very important issues, land access, inequities. I imagine that programs like AdMade in Zambia, Campfire in Zimbabwe, they're not tenable there. These community approaches, bringing groups of people together to take on some of these farms and manage for safari, have they been tried? Are there prospects for them in Namibia?
So Professor Zulu writes that, asks that, have there been community conservation initiatives on a bottom-up initiatives to try to take over farms and do this? And the short answer is yes. Within communal areas, there have been, and the community conservancy model in a few areas is quite successful, especially in northwestern Namibia. Damara land in Kaoko is actually very successful. And part of it is because of clever partnerships and an abundance of wildlife. But in some areas where you don't maybe have this exotic species, but where you're dealing with sort of much more, maybe a large number, but much more ordinary species, it's less successful. So you are seeing a few conservancies that do very, very well, and who often have maybe engaged in a partnership with a foreign hotel company. And there have been some benefits coming from this, and it's maybe a model to try to deal with hunting quotas to be allocated and profits to be raised from it. Because while Black Namibians don't as landowners, don't as individuals within communal areas have property rights over wild animals, the conservancy body as a whole does. So that is an important tool that people have been using. But again, it is subjected to government legislation. It's subjected to a lot of things, and these foreign companies do send a lot of the money out. So there's growing pains, but there's steps in the right direction. I hope that answers a little bit. Yes, sir.
Piggybacking on Dr. Kulu here, and I'm reminded of the documentary Milking the Rhino, which then I actually was going to ask you for a little help, actually, because this is a documentary focusing on community-based conservation efforts. For those of you that may not watch it know, it's a comparative case study with Namibia and then Kenya with Maasai and the Himba, which I'm actually showing in my classes. So that's where I actually ask for your help. Like, it's getting kind of long in the tooth. I think it's like 2008. Because I was kind of curious, and I don't know how familiar you are.
Yeah.
You know, kind of
it's been a bit of time, but yeah.
Like with that particular case, yeah, like updates that particular, like the night hunts, for example. And
so
you alluded to it. You said in some cases that it is successful.
So there are a few conservancies. The professor was asking about the documentary film Milking the Rhino, which is a comparative documentary film looking at northwestern Namibia and central Kenya and community conservation initiatives there. So the short of bring up to speed is check my book, which is coming out. I gotta.
That's updated. Rhino is not.
So check my book, which is coming out, which is actually a comparison of southern Namibia and central Kenya, and so there's 2 chapters on central Kenya. But the short of it is there are a number of conservancies in northwestern Namibia which are fairly successful and which are able to tap into the trophy hunting market, and the allocation of hunting rights is a major portion of conservancy revenue. At the same time, when you look at conservancies across the board, across Namibia, and you look at the relationship between conservancies and hotel partners, business partners, the statistic from a team at the University of Cologne showed that 73% of revenue, I believe, by the foreign companies and moved overseas. So that's not a good number in my opinion. And I believe it's 73% is the number. But I'm a little less familiar with northern Namibia. As it relates to the question of Kenya, right now you are seeing a lot of controversy over this sale of carbon credits, which is what they have been going into. And the program was, after a giant investigation by Survival International, was put on hold. And it's not always been looking quite as nice on that side. So, but anyway, these are things I'm trying to dig in, especially in the north of Namibia, where I don't have as much experience. It's supposed to be, if Brill is listening, get it out by December when you said you would. December or January. Thank you.
But just to respond to Brooks' question, you see, when you talk of the Yimba people, you see, they're in the culinary. That's why you're comparing the Yimba versus the Maasai. These are nomadic people. If you go to culinary, you will find that the government tried to do what they call, modernize, civilize, but they build the good structures and whatever, but they are not benefiting the Yimba community. The Yimba people are actually getting more impoverished. If you go to that town now, you find it's the people that work there, they are from the Brill region or the Ovamboland in these government structures. So the Yimba remains where they were. They are getting poorer by the day. Their land is taken. If there is any consensus or any agreement, they are not part of that. And it's the same thing you find the Maasai and also Botswana. That's why the San communities were fighting the case against the Botswana government when they were being removed from the conservative. They want the case in the court, but no government support. So they are still very, but there was even a presentation by one of these AAP scholars, was the PhD scholar recently, to get a presentation, let's check with the AAP. It's a very, very good presentation because she's working with those communities. It's a very similar case, especially for Namibia and Botswana, because the same terrain and the same people set the similarities, but especially the San communities. In Namibia, they are there in Chitabis. But when we talk of the Yimbas, I went there, spent some 2 weeks collecting data there. Those people are very poor. Their lives are not improved. And even they are not, the government, they say they wanted to modernize and bring development to the community. But who is the development and who is the beneficiary of that? It's not.
No, but by and large, it has not been.
Yeah. So this is the problem that we have. The nomadic guys are always overtaken by the groups that want to set a permanent. And if you look at Namibia also in terms of inequality, when you talk of bringing about equity and the controls from neo-colonial, it's the same thing. The powerful people who get the best things, whether it's the international tourism. Namibia, Zimbabwe, all these guys, who benefits first from this land reform? Of government ministers, the army generals, and all those with political ties and connections. Especially for Namibia, when you talk of that land reform, the buyer willing seller model, even Kawambe Kenyatta has complained about, because that's what South Africa was using. They cannot go the Zimbabwean route because you get punished by the international community.
Yeah.
So in Namibia also, even there was one guy, that Venue Street. It's named after a person.
Yes.
48 farms.
Yeah.
When they started the land reform, he said to Sam Leoma, okay, fine. I will give you 13 for free. Then they remain 35. But those 13 are those where you struggle to farm it, like I said. You need to intensify.
Yeah. So for those online, what Chinjerai was saying is land reform can often be bound up with corruption and power politics and things like this, which is absolutely true. And it is something which, when it occurs, which is more often than it should, it needs to be investigated. I tend to take a really simple view on it, though, which is, if we had a government-owned lodge where 73% of the money disappeared and went into an overseas bank account, that would be a gigantic corruption scandal. When you have that occurring with a private hotel company where the contract allows them to send that money, you've let them do so. Sometimes it's good to know who to be mad at. Very simple view.
What's the refrain?
Ryan.
I would, yeah, I guess I'm interested in how you're thinking about the environment. And I think you mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the ecology. So, I'm curious first, like, how is this land being used for the establishment? It seems, at least from the presentation, that seasonal migration where other people would like and then secondly, when it comes to kind of changes over time, it seems that the environment does play a role in the night harvest because it was the droughts that kind of fueled kind of an interest in alternative economic use of the farms. Are there instances where there's a reverse to this, where the privatization of this land, creation of farms, the fencing, does that create ecological changes as well that influence this history that's happening in rural areas?
Thank you. So Ryan asked a little bit about how was land being used prior to demarcation into commercial farms, but also did such demarcation and fencing allow for some kind of other ecological changes relating to like wildlife species? Am I understanding correct?
Or the animals.
Yeah. I mean, so for those who have spent time with me, I research a lot of sheep farming, and that's what got me into this, is I was asking questions of how did people get out of the late 1970s, early 1980s drought, when the apartheid state was beginning to be a bit hollowed out. There was sort of this transitional government in play. And the answer was these night harvests was the way that a lot of people managed to convert their flock from Karakul to something else using the capital they earned from this. So that's ultimately what got me asking these questions. Was I entered into it through an interest in sheep. You know, a lot of these peripheral farms, especially along the Namib, were not central within, like, let's take this one, Kanan. We're not central within Nama communities' ancestral lands. I mean, it was on the fringe of it, and we do have evidence when we look at old surveyor maps of boreholes. We can examine certain descriptions attached to the boreholes, how knowledge was obtained about these areas. And we do have a lot of these areas as seasonal migration zones. When grazing was declining due to perhaps drought or perhaps population influx, individuals were able to migrate into the Namib Desert to take advantage of this grass before the zebra do. And that was one of the main uses of these farms before. And the only thing which opened them up as commercial farms for apartheid settlement purposes was advances of borehole drilling, which occurred in the aftermath of the Second World War. The ability to drill deeper and to have new means of identifying places to drill. That was one of the limiting factors of these peripheral farms to be permanently settled. And the fencing was partially about the wildlife, but it was mostly about jackals. It was mostly about jackals being able to control predator populations. Because ultimately, a lot of game species, the fences are only about 3 feet high. Kudu jump right over them. They keep in springbok generally, but most other species can either jump over them or tear them up out of the sand and go underneath them. But they were laid actually for jackals and controlling jackal numbers, which is the main predator in these areas. So it did alter the grazing structure quite a bit. But a lot of these farms using this capital intensive methods divided farms into 30, 40 separate different rotational grazing camps, which made them remarkably durable as sheep farms. And it's risky to make claims as to whether or not that's a more sustainable use than what we're seeing today. People try to with repeat photographs to examine, but tends to be very selectively chosen. So anyway, those are some thoughts. I hope that at least nudges in the direction you were asking. Yeah.
So just a question, kind of following the same path, looking at the amount. So you have mentioned that there was 13K zebra hunting permits issued, up to 20 zebras per permit. I did like the math on my calculator. It said up to like 260,000 zebras. And so were those permits per year? They were yearly permits that were issued, or was that for a certain amount of time? So I guess what I'm kind of looking at here is that's a large amount of animals that were displaced or killed, which would have impacted the African environment, like African communities. And then you had said that for some of the fencing on the properties, animals could jump over them or they weren't as confined. So during these night hunts, were there animals that would go in and out of these people's properties that local populations normally relied on? And then when you're investigating these night harvests, did you encounter any discourse where local communities were complaining about the lack of a certain animal because it was killed during these night harvests, or maybe they weren't seeing it as often? So maybe that's one question. What was the discourse between local populations during these night hunts?
It's interesting. I mean, so you were permitted, I believe, 20 zebra per license. People didn't always kill 20 zebra per license. We don't have numbers because the reporting was not very good in those days, but we have the amount of permits issued because that's what the government tracked. But yes, I mean, that would drastically impact game numbers along the edge of the desert. But of course, they were trying to turn the desert into sheep farming territory, so it didn't bother them very much. It was for them a sign of civilization coming. If you're able to replace wild animals with domesticated ones, that was viewed as a positive thing by the apartheid regime, at least. As it relates to the night harvest questions, that's a great one, and I don't have a great answer. I mean, the funny thing is despite the I forget precisely the amount killed of springbok over that time period, at least reported as killed. But I mean, we're dealing with hundreds of thousands of springbok being killed, and they were able to bounce back remarkably quickly. So in a way, it kind of shows also a little bit of the durability of this landscape for wildlife, despite all of this occurring. But this is something I need to dig deeper into. I don't have all the answers.
Okay, thank you.
So thanks.
Maybe one more question.
I think we have we do have questions online. So we have Jacob asks, how did COVID push back conservation efforts in terms of funding and staffing in the national parks and protected areas, and how have they combated these challenges? That's interesting. And I must say, I don't have good statistics on that. Some like the state-owned Namibia wildlife resorts did release quite a lot of employees during lockdowns. And some companies, private companies such as Gondwana, cut salaries, but did not fire quite as many people. I don't have good statistics on this. This is now very contemporary, and I try to work in the past a little bit and just nudge to the present. But I think this has given me something to look into a little more. So I'm sorry I don't have good information on that. And then Solomon, as long as any form of corruption is tolerated, the people in the country will suffer. I also think corruption becomes a way of life and normalized, don't you? Well, that's for deeper philosophers than I, Solomon. That is for deeper philosophers than I, and come next time and we'll talk more about it in person. But it certainly becomes normalized in a lot of countries, and I'm from New York, and we're looking what's happening with the mayor of New York right now. So yeah, there we go. Solomon, Jacob, thank you for your questions. I think Dr. Sarr is nudging me that we are out of time.
No, you should tell him about the 5 ministers from Namibia who are still in the custody because of the issue scandal.
Oh, that's a whole nother. I could talk for an hour and a half on that. Thank you all who came online. I appreciate it.